While the Greek city-states might have been colonizing, Cyrus the Great was about to take over an empire. At the time, the Persians were subjugated to the rule of the Medes Empire. According to legend, after his grandson Cyrus was born, King Astyages of Medes had a vivid dream that his little grandson would one day stage a revolt against him. King Astyages knew what to do and ordered his chief advisor to kill the baby. But the chief advisor gave the baby off to a shepherd to be raised instead. However, troubles weren't over for Cyrus. When he was 10, King Astyages found Cyrus. King Astyages wanted to kill him because the dream was very clear. This man will revolt against you. Yet, against his better senses, Cyrus was allowed to live. King Astyages' biggest mistake. When Cyrus was a man, he gathered his army and revolted against his maternal grandfather. The two, but as prophecy had it, Astyages surrendered in 550 BCE. However, Cyrus wasn't done conquering. He conquered Babylon and became the supreme ruler of Mesopotamia and even the Indus Valley civilization. The world was in Cyrus's hand. Cyrus then took over the Greek colony of Ionia in Asia Minor, leading a great Persian empire. And then he died, leaving it all in the air for the next great Persian king, Darius the Great. While back in Greece, various city-states started to gain power, but two were at the forefront: Sparta and Athens. Sparta was a military powerhouse. The famous Spartans believed everything should focus on physical strength and war. When a new young Spartan was born, it would be slaughtered if it didn't look healthy. Boys were taken from their families at a young age and were trained to become soldiers. The brutal training included physical conditioning, weapons training, and harsh living conditions. The entire life of a Spartan was to win a war. Their society reflects it with three main groups. The ruling class consisted of aristocrats who held political power, the free non-citizens who were not allowed to participate in government but were still expected to serve in the military, and the helots, a group of enslaved people that provided labor for the Spartan state. Life in Sparta was harsh, brutal, and militaristic. While their neighbors up north were experimenting with this idea of democracy, Athenian democracy was a highly complicated mess. There were two branches, the Council of 500 and the Assembly. The Council of 500 was selected randomly by a process known as sortition. Athens itself was made up of 10 different tribes. Each tribe was responsible for providing 50 citizens to serve for 1 year in the Council of 500 via random selection. Each eligible citizen would be given a personalized token. Those tokens were inserted into a particular machine called a clariturion. This long-lost technology included tubes and balls, which somehow selected 50 residents of each tribe to join the illustrious Council of 500. While in the Assembly, there was a system in place that said that every single citizen had a vote. Of course, to be a citizen, you had to be a male and not a slave, and either born in Athens or to Athenian parents. The Council of 500 would create the agenda for the main assembly to vote on because over 30,000 people could have a vote at any given time. It was total chaos. So to quell this, the council would nominate 9 presidents the morning of the meeting, and it was their job to ensure all the rules and procedures were being followed. Since they were appointed right before the assembly met, they were almost impossible to bribe. Somehow, the assembly would loudly vote on whether a bill would pass. They would vote on matters like appointing generals, various laws, and other government bureaucracy. However, not everyone liked this Athenian democracy. The famous Greek philosopher Plato thought the idea was barbaric. In Book 6 of his seminal book, The Republic, Plato writes, "The true navigator must study the seasons of the year, the sky, the stars, the winds, and all the other subjects appropriate to his profession if he is really fit to control the ship. Think that it's quite impossible to acquire the professional skill needed for such control, and that there's no such thing as the art of navigation." How much could a randomly selected member of the Council of 500 really know? How much could he fully contribute to society? Should we allow a random member of society to have any power? Instead, Plato would advocate for the idea of a philosopher king, a man who studies wisdom, logic, and reasoning, a man who dedicates his life to understanding how to be just, a man who will become the navigator of wisdom. Plato would rather say, the society we have described can never grow into a reality or see the light of day, and there will be no end to the troubles of the states, or indeed, my dear Glaucon, of humanity itself, till philosophers become rulers in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers, and political power and philosophy thus come into the same hands. There's just one issue with Plato's quote. Every leader thinks they're a philosopher king. Everyone thinks their thoughts are the best. Everyone thinks their ideas are the wisest. From Yu the Great in China, to Labarnus of the Hittite Empire, to Siddhartha Gautama of the Kingdom of Magadha in India. While not so far away, in the Indian Kingdom of Magadha, a spoiled prince named Siddhartha Gautama, 500 BCE, lived in luxury inside a palace. Inside this palace, Siddhartha could have anything he wanted. All the jewels, all the wealth, all the finest goods thrust upon him. His world inside of the palace was a utopia on earth. There was no want, need, or desire, and it was perfect. Until he went outside his palace compound, the only place he ever knew. As he took his first steps outside of his palace, what he saw struck a chord. He saw an old man dying right on the street in front. He realized that the human experience wasn't something that was perfect and sublime. Instead, it was death. As Gilgamesh realized many years ago, this was an inevitable part of the human experience. Siddhartha left his life of luxury behind and began a quest for knowledge and enlightenment. He studied with spiritual teachers and meditated for many years, searching for answers to life's big questions. Finally, after 6 years of seeking, he sat down under a fig tree and meditated until he achieved enlightenment. Enlightenment is a state of inner peace, in which one has transcended the limitations of the ego and is in touch with a universal consciousness or divine essence. It isn't a fixed and permanent thing, but rather an ongoing process of growth and development. But under that fig tree, Siddhartha became known as the Buddha, or the Awakened One. He would spend the rest of his life traveling the countryside, becoming close to the Enlightenment. Darius was determined to follow in his father's footsteps and take over the world. After finalizing their rule over the city-state of Ionia, the Persians were on a quest to take over Greece. Darius and his 20,000 men came to the city of Marathon in the year 490 BCE, a city 26.2 miles away from Athens. The Athenians were vastly outnumbered, with only 10,000 men. As the Persians were trying to regroup, the powerful Greek hoplites crushed the weaker Persian foot soldiers by routing the wings before turning towards the center of the Persian line. The remnants of the Persian army fled to their ships and left the battle. Early historians believe the battlefield littered 6,400 Persian bodies, while the Athenians lost only 192. So the Persians retreated, and an Athenian messenger named Pheidippides ran the 26.2 miles from Marathon to Athens, exclaiming with joy how the Athenians just beat the mighty Persian Empire. All of Athens went crazy with this fantastic news, hence leading the Pheidippides' historic trek to be sketched into history as the world's first marathon. However, the Persians weren't done, even with Darius I dying of mysterious circumstances. His son, Xerxes I, took over the crown and wanted to complete his grandfather's legacy. In 480 BCE, Xerxes I wanted revenge, so he brought his enormous invasion force of over 100,000 soldiers and was dead set on conquering Greece. Then, at a narrow pass at Thermopylae, the Spartan king Leonidas had his force of 7,000 Spartans maintain the defense. Leonidas knew of his disadvantage and developed a bold and daring plan to defeat the Persians. Rather than waiting for the Persians to attack, Leonidas ordered his soldiers to make a surprise attack on the Persian camp, catching the Persians off guard and disrupting their formation. Despite their success, the Greek army was ultimately overwhelmed by the Persians, who attacked from all sides and eventually broke through the Greek defenses. Leonidas and his soldiers fought with courage and determination. Still, they were ultimately defeated. Then came the Battle of Salamis, where the Greeks could change the tilt of the war in a naval battle between the 500 Persian trireme and 300 Greek trireme. It didn't look good for the Greeks. Still, the great Athenian general, Themistocles, employed his plan to move the Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis and hit the enemy fleet so hard that it had nowhere to retreat. After a massive sea battle, Themistocles won Greece the victory and changed the face of the war. The Persians still had their goal: conquer the Greek city-states. Xerxes had returned to Persia, leaving Persian general Mardonius in charge of the Persian force for most of the significant battle yet. After diplomatic talks ceased, Persia knew they had to attack. As the Persians sent their troops to Plataea, the Greeks knew they had to work together. With 30 various Greek city-states working together, they were able to field a massive 110,000 hoplite army with the primary purpose of defeating Persia, though that was nothing compared to the estimated 150,000-man army of Persia. The battle was fierce and intense, with both sides fighting with ferocity and determination. The Greek hoplites continued to be effective against the Persian cavalry and archers. The Greeks also strategically used the terrain, fighting on a slope that helped offset the Persian numerical advantage. In the end, the Greeks defeated the Persian forces and secured a decisive victory. The Persians suffered heavy losses, and Mardonius was killed in the fighting. The Battle of Plataea marked the end of the Greco-Persian Wars and the Persian threat to Greece. After the Persian War, life in ancient Greece was spectacular. A golden age of culture was upon us. With no longer having to face the threat of war, Athens was able to create architectural wonders, such as the Parthenon. The Parthenon sits upon the Athenian Acropolis, a prominent hill overlooking the city of Athens, to show its wealth and culture. No matter where you'll go in Athens, you can still see the Great Parthenon even today. Then came the theater. Around this time, the state would sponsor the most significant poets to create stories in the Athenian festival, called the City Dionysia, a festival designed to worship the Greek god of theater and fertility, Dionysus, creating playwrights such as Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Aristophanes. States were hungry for power. Athens was recruiting city-states into their Delian alliance, while Sparta was recruiting city-states into their Peloponnesian alliance. Both Sparta and Athens felt like they should control the city of Korkia, hence why in 434 BCE, war was upon the Greek peninsula, resulting in naval battles such as the Battle of Siblos and the Battle of Pylos. By 421 BCE, a short peace was negotiated. However, this peace would not last, and Athens had their eyes on Sicily. Initially, the expedition was going well. The Athenians established alliances with several Sicilian cities and won several minor skirmishes against the Sicilian forces. But soon, Alcibiades, one of the greatest naval generals in history, was recalled to Athens to face charges of sacrilege. The Athenian fleet was left without his leadership. In his absence, the expedition began to unravel. The Athenians could not take the city of Syracuse, which had fortified its defenses and was well prepared for a siege. The Sicilians were aided by reinforcements from Sparta, which saw an opportunity to strike a crippling blow against its arch-rival Athens. The Athenians suffered from a lack of supplies and were plagued by disease. At the same time, the Syracusans launched a series of surprise attacks and ambushes. Finally, after months of grueling fighting, the Athenian fleet was destroyed in a decisive battle. Thousands of Athenians were killed, and many more were captured and enslaved. A decade after that, Athens fell to the Spartans. The age of legendary Greece was now over. Both Athens and Sparta were significantly weaker, never to regain the same power they once had, leaving the world ready for a philosopher king to conquer it all. Then, in the east, the mandate of heaven was up. The Zhou dynasty, after a long 800-year rule, it was deemed by the heavens that their empire was up, which led to a period known as the Warring States, 474 to 221 BCE. This resulted in Han Fizi, who created a new philosophy called legalism. Followers of legalism believed that people were inherently selfish and would only act in their own self-interest, and that the only way to keep them in line was through a system of rewards and punishments that was clear and consistently enforced. This resulted in Fizi claiming that the best way to achieve social order was by establishing a powerful ruler responsible for enforcing the law and punishing wrongdoers. He also believed the ruler should have complete control over the military, the economy, and society. While in the heart of the Oaxaca region of Mexico, the Zapotec civilization started to flourish. The capital city of Monte Alban was being built on a mountaintop overlooking the entire Oaxaca Valley. Perched on the mountaintop overlooking the Valley of Oaxaca, the city was home to a ruling elite who oversaw a hierarchical social structure that included middle-class artisans and lower-class farmers. The people of the Zapotec civilization were known for their innovative agricultural practices, including the cultivation of maize and other crops, which sustained their communities in times of drought and other environmental pressures. They also developed an early writing system, which used a combination of symbols and glyphs to represent words and ideas. They developed an advanced calendar system based on 260-day and 365-day solar cycles. In Greece, during the year 356 BCE, in the city of Pella in the Kingdom of Macedon, the greatest commander in history was born. Alexander the Great grew up knowing he would be a leader, and was the son of King Philip II and Queen Olympia. But the teacher was much more impressive. Since he was a kid, Alexander was tutored by Aristotle. Aristotle is the man who is known as the father of logic. He created the fields of biology and taxonomy by introducing a way to think called the scientific method, a method that is still taught in schools to this day. He also wrote extensively about philosophy, ethics, and art, changing the face of the world as we know it today. This is the man who was in charge of teaching Alexander the Great. Alexander was 20 when his father was assassinated, but his excellent education allowed him to take over the rest of the world. After his father died in 336 BCE, Alexander was hell-bent on keeping his family's power. So when the Greek city of Thebes decided to revolt, Alexander and his army marched 240 miles in 14 days. When Thebes refused to surrender, he razed the entire city to the ground, and 6,000 were killed, and the rest were sold into slavery. The rest of the Greek city-states recoiled in fear, allowing Alexander to do as he pleased, leaving for his new target to be Persia and the new Persian king, Darius III. In 333 BC, Alexander faced the Persian army at the Battle of Issus. This significant engagement saw the Persian king Darius III defeated and forced to flee. Alexander then captured several key cities, including the vital port of Tyre, which had resisted his initial siege. In 331 BC, Alexander faced Darius III again at the Battle of Gaugamela, near the Tigris River in modern-day Iraq. Despite being outnumbered, Alexander won a decisive victory using superior tactics and mobility. The Persian army was shattered, and Darius III fled once again. Alexander then proceeded to capture the Persian capital of Babylon, and took control of much of Mesopotamia. He continued his campaign eastward, winning battles in what is now modern-day Iran and Afghanistan. In 330 BC, he captured the Persian capital of Persepolis, a city of great wealth and cultural significance. But Alexander wasn't done. He wanted to expand eastward, eventually crossing the Hindu Kush Mountains into India. However, his troops grew tired of the endless fighting and refused to go any further, and Alexander was forced to turn back. However, after Alexander failed in the Indian subcontinent, a powerhouse emerged in India called the Mauryan Empire. At its height, it spanned over much of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. However, this conquering came at much of a cost for its leader Ashoka the Great. In 261 BC, after the death of his parents, Ashoka decided that his empire needed to expand. In his sights, the kingdom of Kalinga. The war was bloody, the war was fierce. Over 100,000 people died. Ashoka couldn't sleep with himself. He didn't know how to deal with his actions that resulted in so much death. So he turned to the teaching of the Buddha. Under Ashoka's rule, the Mauryan Empire became known for supporting Buddhist teachings and promoting nonviolence. Ashoka issued a series of edicts inscribed on rocks and pillars throughout the empire that promoted principles such as kindness, respect for all religions, and the abolition of slavery. Certain traits were not shared in the West by Alexander. In the West, it was deemed honorable to die in combat, and a hero's death would be remembered forever. A farmer will die in anonymity. Alexander died a few years later in Babylon at the age of 32. Throughout his expedition, Alexander was spreading Greek ideas founded by his once wise teacher, bringing the rise of Greek ideals across the land, starting the seeds of the Western cultures we see today. Once Alexander died, his empire just could not sustain itself. His generals feuded as to who should be the leader of this great empire. Everyone wanted power, yet in fighting, left to waste in oblivion. Eventually, in 323 BC, after senseless wars, the Greek generals divided the world into three major empires: the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in the east, and the Antigonids in Greece. Ptolemies, one of Alexander's generals, led Egypt into a period of prosperity. Inspiration by his former leader, Ptolemies built the Library of Alexandria, a hub for an intellectual scholarship. Intellectuals from all over will come to the library to exchange ideas and thoughts throughout the world, leaving us to have great philosophers like Plato and Aristotle to be the backbone of our culture. While the general Seleucid was given the keys to the city of Babylon. Babylon at this time was a cultural hub melting Greek, Persian, Indian, and Central Asian cultures. Seleucid, though, preferred Greek ideas and Greek language. The Seleucid Empire was at its height during the reign of King Antiochus III, 223 BC to 187 BC. Under King Antiochus III, the Seleucids encompassed a vast territory from modern-day Turkey to modern-day Pakistan, one of the largest empires on record until the rise of the Romans. While the Antigonids did not have nearly as much success. By the time Antigonids I took power, the Greeks were just a shell of what they once were. The age of the Greeks was behind us. The Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and the Antigonids went astray from the Roman Empire. However, for Rome to rise, it had to face a powerful foe, Carthage. Both Rome and Carthage had a desire for the same city-state, Messina, on the island of Sicily. This would give either civilization a foothold to grab power in the Mediterranean. The First Punic War was upon us, and after 20 years of fighting, in the year 241 BCE, and the defeat of Carthage, the Treaty of Lutatius was signed. The peace, though, was short-lived. In 218 BCE, the Second Punic Wars began when the Carthaginian general Hannibal invaded Italy with his army, including elephants, to conquer Rome. Hannibal won several early battles, including the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE. Still, he was ultimately defeated by the Roman general Scipio Africanus at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. The war resulted in the complete defeat of Carthage, which was forced to cede its territories to Rome, and the end of the Carthaginian Empire. There was no doubt in the world anymore that it was time for the Romans to take charge in the West. While in the East, after the end of the Warring States period, Qin Shi Huang and the Qin dynasty were an absolute power. 221 BCE to 206 BCE, Qin was determined to turn diverse China into a unified Chinese empire. He divided the lands into 36 command areas supervised by a governor, military commander, and imperial inspector. It was expected that you followed the will of Qin, or else you would face harsh penalties. The basic ideas of legalism in action, strong government, harsh laws, and inheriting knowing that humans were necessarily selfish. However, their mandate from heaven ran quite quickly. After Qin Shi Huang's death, China was in turmoil with another dynasty on foot. Liu Bang, leader from 206 to 195 BCE, after leading a revolt against the Qin, was declared emperor of the new Han dynasty. Instead of following the strict legalistic mindset of the Qin, Liu decided to set his empire as a Confucianist paradise. The ideals of moderation, virtue, and piety, as set through Confucianism, were marched throughout the empire, weaving the cocoon of a powerful dynasty. During the Han dynasty, the production of silk was ever increasing, and the idea of profits was in the minds of all. So in 138 BCE, Emperor Han Wu sent an imperial convoy to make contact with cultures of Central Asia and the Mediterranean. Then, after the routes were established, Chinese merchants and traders would bring their silk across the Silk Road to the Middle East and eventually Europe, where it would be sold at high profits. Though in the beginning, the route was relatively short. Because in 97 BC, Ambassador Kan Ying was sent to Rome with gifts of silk for their empire. However, Kan only got as far as Mesopotamia because he was told by the Parthians, the dominant empire in Iran at the time, that the journey would take years. Little did Kan know that he was misinformed, that the journey would have been relatively shorter, but the Parthians wanted to keep their spot as the middlemen. They did not want China and Rome to have contact with one another, creating a system of three empires smushed right up against each other: Rome in the west, Parthians in the center, and China in the east. Then in 86 BCE, Greece, already being weakened by the conquest of Alexander the Great, was now the target of the Roman Empire. General Lucius Cornelius Sulla led an army of legions to the forefront of Athens. He besieged Athens for several months, brutally torturing the citizens within. Eventually, when Athens fell, he ordered his soldiers to loot and pillage the city, destroying many important cultural treasures. This takeover cemented Rome as a superpower. Athens no longer had the power, but rather it was in Rome. While in 63 BCE, General Pompey was tasked with capturing Jerusalem and the region of Galilee, the Romans quickly captured the cities, forcing Galilee to be placed under Roman rule, including a small village called Nazareth. The Romans' desire to expand didn't end in Galilee though. In 58 BCE, Julius Caesar was appointed governor of the Roman Province of Sicilian Gaul, northern Italy, with the express assignment of conquering the rest of the Gauls. At the time, the Gauls were a group of Celtic peoples who lived in that area that is now France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland, Germany, and Italy. However, it was Caesar's job to take over these Celtic tribes, while the Gauls, who were insistent on their independence, all had to work together under the leadership of Vercingetorix in a last-ditch attempt to stop the Romans. As Caesar brought his troops to Alesia in 52 BC, war was upon us. Alesia was surrounded by a double wall and a ditch. with additional fortifications on the town's hills. Vercingetorix had gathered a large force of Gallic warriors inside the town. In contrast, Caesar had assembled a sizable Roman army outside the walls. Caesar realized that a direct assault on the town would be complex, so he surrounded the Gallic forces and starved them into submission. He ordered the construction of a series of fortifications around Alesia, including a circumvallation wall that encircled the town, and a second wall and ditch that faced outward to defend against any attempts to break out. Over several weeks, Caesar's forces engaged in a grueling siege of Alesia, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The Gallic warriors inside the town made several attempts to break out, but they were repelled by the Roman forces. The tide of the battle turned in favor of the Romans when a second Gallic army, led by Vercingetorix's ally Commius, attempted to relieve the siege. Caesar sent a detachment of his forces to intercept the Gallic reinforcements. After a fierce battle, the Roman soldiers emerged victorious. With his forces surrounded and facing starvation, Vercingetorix was forced to surrender. He emerged from Alesia and offered himself as a prisoner to Caesar, effectively ending the Gallic resistance to Roman rule. Throughout the next 2 years, Caesar crossed the Gallic Empire, conquering and implementing it into Rome. The Gauls were implemented into Rome, even gaining citizenship within the empire. However, the Senate was not happy with Caesar. Even though he had great success against the Gauls, the Roman Senate wanted him to stop. They did not like the popularity Caesar was gaining, nor the power he was controlling. So the Roman Senate called upon Caesar to resign his command and disband his army, or risk being declared an enemy of the state. This led Caesar to an essential choice to make. Will he either follow the will of the Roman Senate or ignore them and start a bloody civil war? Roman law at the time prohibited any general from crossing the Rubicon River and entering mainland Italy with a standing army without the expressed permission of the Roman Senate. To do so would be treason, and this tiny stream would reveal Caesar's intentions and mark the point of no return. Civil war was imminent as Caesar and his army marched over the Rubicon. Battles in Corfinium and Pharsalus showed the Senate that Caesar was a worthy foe, so the Roman Senate appointed his son-in-law, Gnaeus Pompey, to lead the Roman forces against his father-in-law. Both parties knew the importance of Spain, due to it providing a link between Italy and the rest of Europe. The two armies clashed near the town of Leda in northeastern Spain. Caesar's army was significantly outnumbered, but he could use his superior military tactics and training to gain the upper hand in the battle. After several days of intense fighting, Caesar emerged victorious, forcing Pompey's forces to retreat, declaring Caesar as the new leader of Rome. When Caesar made it back to Rome, the crowds were chanting, "Hail Caesar! Hail Caesar!" The people then decided that he would be the dictator of Rome for life. Caesar immediately set to work, implementing a series of reforms and policies aimed at improving ordinary Romans' lives and strengthening the central government's power. He ordered the construction of new infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, and aqueducts, which helped to connect different parts of the city and improve trade and commerce. Caesar also enacted a series of political and social reforms, including granting citizenship to many people living in the Roman Empire and creating new laws and customs that were based on Roman practices. He encouraged the spread of the Latin language and culture throughout the city and established the Julian calendar, which is the basis of the calendar we use today. However, Caesar's reign was short-lived because 2 years later, in 44 BC, he was stabbed to death by two loyal senators, Cassius and Brutus. The assassination of Caesar led the Roman world into disarray. The world was filled with factions vying for government control without a strong leader. Octavian, Caesar's son, who was 18 then, came to Rome to claim his inheritance and assert his place in the political landscape. He quickly aligned himself with Caesar's loyal lieutenant, Mark Antony. Together, they defeated Caesar's assassins at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. However, tensions soon arose between Octavian and Antony as both men vied for control of the Roman Empire. In 31 BCE, their forces clashed in the naval battle of Actium, which resulted in Octavian emerging as the clear victor. Antony fled to Egypt with his lover, Cleopatra, and the two committed suicide the following year. With Antony's defeat, Octavian emerged as the undisputed ruler of Rome. In 27 BCE, he was appointed Augustus and became the first Roman emperor. During Augustus's reign, a man who would change the world was born in the Roman-occupied city of Bethlehem, Jesus Christ. The Gospel of Luke says, "In those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town." Luke 2:1-3. This census was an essential factor in Roman society, because it established the population counts in these various communities, making it possible to tax these various citizens. So the highly pregnant Mary and her betrothed husband Joseph had to travel 90 miles on foot from Nazareth to Bethlehem to complete this legally required Roman census. When they arrived in Bethlehem, many other descendants of the King of David, or members of the Jewish faith, were also going to Bethlehem for the census. They found out that there was no room for them in the inn, so they were forced to take shelter in a stable where Mary gave birth to Jesus. Jesus was later named King of the Jews. After Jesus' birthday and the completion of the census, Mary and Joseph returned to Nazareth with their extraordinary son. As the years of Jesus went on, stories about him grew. More and more followers began to worship Jesus as their Messiah. They claim that he can catch an endless amount of fish. They claim that he can cure the blind, and they claim that he was the Son of God. So these followers, specifically his disciples, started to write down his entire life journey. 4 of his closest disciples, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, wrote down the main chunks of the book in these parts called Gospels. Each of these Gospels covered almost all of the same events, the narrative life of Jesus Christ. This narrative testimony of a child born in a stable changed the world forever. Even though many loved Jesus, some viewed him as a threat. Emperor Tiberius succeeded Augustus and reigned from 14 AD to 37 AD. Tiberius was notorious for his delators, a network of informants rewarded for spying and reporting on suspected traitors and criminals. Criminals reported on by the delators had to face a treason trial, often resulting in executions or forced suicides. His prefect of Judea at the time, Pontius Pilate, was no stranger to the harsh punishment of traitors. As Jesus was influencing more and more people, he became more of a political threat. So, following the guidelines of Emperor Tiberius, Pilate was given no practical political choice other than to execute Jesus on the cross. Roman law was evident then. One must follow the emperor's will or else they will perish. As Jesus was crucified on the cross, a new religion was born: Christianity. In the beginning, Christianity was just a small sect of Judaism. Nevertheless, its growth would be unparalleled. Paul of Taurus would take the word of his chosen Lord across the known world. From Greece to Turkey to Syria, the word of Jesus Christ spread. His missionary tales are now documented in the New Testament as the Book of Acts. The more Paul went to different places, the more followers he gained. On the same token, it created more enemies. The divide between monotheism and polytheism was on the rise. It was beginning to get a lot tougher for Romans to accept a religious population that didn't believe in gods like Mars and Jupiter. So when the Great Fire of Rome occurred in July of 64 AD, Emperor Nero quickly blamed it on the Christians. The Great Fire was an event that destroyed 2/3 of the city of Rome. So, in order to pay for these massive repairs, Nero instituted heavy tributes across the empire. To meet at least a proportion of the costs, Nero also started to print more Roman currency. creating an inflationary effect for the first time in the empire's history. However, the individuals who lived under Roman rule, which wasn't in Rome proper, were upset by this new policy. So, in the holy city of Jerusalem in 66 AD, a revolt was on. At first, the first Jewish revolt succeeded, and the Jewish forces quickly expelled the unprepared Roman army. Then, the rebels gained some traction in the neighboring villages in Galilee. In response, the Roman Emperor Nero sent the general Vespasian to meet the Jewish forces, an endeavor that pushed most rebels into Jerusalem proper by the time Vespasian was proclaimed emperor in 69 CE. Then, around Passover in 70 AD, Vespasian and his forces sieged the city, depleting it of food and water within the walls of Jerusalem. The Jews started to quarrel within, leaving them more vulnerable to attack. By August, the Romans breached the defenses, killed much of the population, and destroyed many of their holy sites. With the Jews decimated, the strength of polytheism lived long. Then, in 98 to 117 AD, under Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire was able to expand its greatest territorial extent, spanning all the way from modern-day Britain to the Persian Gulf. Roman rule was everywhere. Well, except for in the Americas, because the Romans didn't even know they existed. In the Americas, we can see the growth of various civilizations across the Andes located in modern-day Peru and Chile. The Mochi civilization was able to build monumental structures, like the Huaca del Sol and Huaca de la Luna, impressive pyramids that were the center of their religions. They also created advanced fertilization techniques that used bird droppings as fertilizer. Their highly centralized government made everyone know their place in society. While a little bit more south, the Nazca civilization is one enthralled in mystery. The people of Nazca created a series of large-scale geoglyphs consisting of hundreds of individual figures, including geometric shapes, animals, and human-like figures, by removing the dark reddish-brown iron oxide-coated pebbles covering the surface of the Nazca Desert. These lines are now called Nazca lines, the purpose of which is still unknown to this day and subject to conspiracy theory today.